Welcome, everyone. My name is Reverend Jude Geiger, Minister for Community Engagement here at Community Church in New York City. Welcome to our next session of Roots to Leaves, where we're talking about the Unitarian Universalist values and principles around how our congregations covenant to affirm the democratic process in our own churches and in the wider world, as well as the right of conscience. And I'm joined with here Brother Zachary, who is our chaplain for pastoral care, and a special treat guest, our senior minister, Reverend Peggy Clarke. And today, I guess the question I'm going to toss to both of you is, how is that principle in our churches and wider world, democratic process, held in tension with the right of conscience? How do you do both at the same time?
First of all, it's great to be here. Thank you, Reverend Jude. And I'm so excited to talk about this because of what I've seen in UU spaces and in this year's General Assembly in particular. And if you didn't know, the Unitarian Universalist denomination recently passed a revision to its second article. The process is deeply rooted in democratic values and the democratic process, but it's also a bit alien for me. It's similar to the democratic processes that unfolds in our political sphere in the United States, but different in some other ways. I noticed some of the similar struggles that plague us in the political sphere were also at play, and the tension of how do we hold in balance our needs as individuals or as marginalized communities with the needs of the wider group. It's really powerful. I know for me as an individual, that tension is uncomfortable. It makes me feel either inadequate on a wider level to have to move forward without the support of a marginalized community. And likewise, if I feel like our civic institutions, our country, our mayor, our politics, local politics are moving in a direction I don't like, it's hard for me to support it. It's hard for me to move forward thinking that I am just as accountable to the structures. I want to push against them. And so I think what I'm trying to voice for me is some of the tension that comes up in the democratic process and how we try to live it out in our congregations, but also in the wider society.
Yeah, and the UU process is different from like the Quaker process, right? We really we kind of do our lobbying, and whether that's on a congregational scale or the whole denomination, we make our argument in a variety of ways and everyone gets a vote and the majority wins, different from the Quaker process where everyone just sits and just waits, right? And it can take forever, but everyone has to agree. Eventually we will all come to a place where we agree, and as UUs we don't do that, which there are advantages to both processes, but I actually appreciate ours because I think it's okay to hold in tension an alternative perspective. I think it's actually good for people to vote against things. I actually was a DRE in a congregation where the board constantly all voted unanimously for everything. And then one of the members was like, I'm not doing it anymore. I am going to tell you why this is bad, like, even if I agree. And she voted against everything, which wasn't that she wasn't actually in agreement, but she just felt like there's something healthy about the tension, about someone saying, like, what's the other side, rather than just going with it. Let's argue the point a little bit. And I think that is good for us. I think it's good in our personal lives too. Just this is what I think I want to do, but what would happen if I did something else?
It reminds me of there's an analogous process within our own youth. So many youth groups or larger councils or whatnot of youth, when they get together at a conference or they get together at a camp and they're discerning what direction they want the group to go in, we've historically had a process where it's consensus building, but it's not consensus building in the way you're talking about with Quakers. It's someone could block a consensus, but you only do that if you think it's a moral or ethical dilemma. And then the process pauses, and it might be a group discussion, or it might be a smaller group discussion with trained facilitators to work through why is this a a moral and ethical issue? And is it actually a moral and ethical issue, or do you just have strong feelings about it, but take the time to center that concern before moving on? But if you don't use that block if you just disagree with with something. Like, okay, if the majority wants to go this way, I disagree, but I don't disagree on ethical guidelines, so I need to just let go, and then that's a consensus.
I love your term consensus building, Reverend Jude, and it's to me, I hear that in both of the sort of democratic technologies of the Quaker process and the UU process. How do we come to an understanding of who we are and what it is that we're doing? It's a process that I hear takes time. And that's not often something we want to devote to understanding someone else. I'm thinking about my own individual experiences of the democratic process, and particularly the uncomfortable ones. Oftentimes, those are the experiences I have that intersect with someone wielding disproportionate power in an event or in a moment. And part of what I feel viscerally as a danger, maybe, or as a fear when I engage in the democratic process is of bullying, of people wielding disproportionate power to cause harm or to influence the system in ways that just don't support every member of the group and of the organization. Unfortunately, as people, we have those tendencies, and it doesn't have to be rooted in any ill will. I think we can get, as a result of trauma or as a result of distress, we can become very defiantly interested and self-interested in unhelpful ways. That, to me, is a powerful obstruction or potential obstruction to the democratic process. I want to be trusting, and I want to be committed to the process, and yet I'm also aware that I bring some of this fear of it, that unfortunately, if we are too process-oriented, we could be subject or victim to bullies.
Well, and I think that's real. I mean, that happens often. I think, if we're talking about this as a principle, I think that is in opposition to what the principle is actually trying to say. The principle is saying that each person is equal and that every voice is valued at the same place. But in reality, there are people in a room who have more power. And sometimes those people will wield that power, and sometimes, I mean, I remember in my last congregation at congregational meetings, I often sat in the back of the room because I felt like just my presence. I'm not going to vote. I'm only going to speak when specifically asked, and yet I know my presence is powerful. And there's sort of nothing to do about that but maybe sit in the back of the room. And even then, I felt like I know that people can feel the pull because it is what power does. And if I left, that would be a different kind of power, right? There is something about trying to navigate that. And for me, that comes down to some level of accountability. How are we each accountable to each other and to the process? And then what is our relationship with each other? For the people who, if you love and trust the minister, then where she sits is less important. But if you're afraid, and if the minister has behaved inappropriately in a whole number of ways, including how they wield power, then being aware is self-protective. So it isn't just that everyone gets a vote. It's also that everyone is being called into authentic relationship with each other and into a sense of egalitarianism and partnership and accountability with each other, which is harder than just saying you get a vote.
That's true. And this sense of accountability feels connected to me as well to how we participate. If you're accountable to the process, then, and you wield disproportionate power, I think there's wisdom in holding back, sort of managing it for the purpose of the healthy conversation. And I love this example, Reverend Peggy, that you use of knowing when to mitigate power and manage power, because in the real world, individuals bring different amounts of power to a conversation. The principle may say that, or in principle, we would like everyone to have an equal vote, but some votes, like in the case of a congregation, the minister's vote, do bring a lot of power. I'm bringing to this conversation also my own Catholic identity and sort of my Catholic critique, I would say, of the right of conscience, because there is a lot of trust. I think that was your word, Reverend Peggy, that comes from the democratic process. We have to trust each other to be wise and rooted. And I don't know that I trust necessarily everyone to be wise and rooted, to participate in this conversation. And as a Catholic, I think I get a lot of comfort thinking that my minister's vote is more powerful. And I would want my minister's vote to be the one that guides the conversation. I see how hierarchy can also be abused. And yet there is such comfort in knowing that those whom we have elected to manage these difficult conversations take that responsibility away from our friends who I don't necessarily trust to be wise and rooted all of the time.
And in UU space, we don't always assume that our leaders are wise and rooted. Conversely, we were talking before this episode a little bit about how the democratic process at its best comes out of the Enlightenment period. And there's also a stuckness when we just stay with that wisdom and don't move forward. I'm reminded right now of Dr. Sasi Diaz's work in Mujerista Theology, Latina wisdom. And she's got a teaching around lo cotidiano, everyday wisdom. Everyday events are as prayerful and as theological as all the big stuff in the world. And I think that whether we say that aloud or not in Unitarian Universalism, there's sort of a mindset that what happens around a meal is just as important as what happens in seminary.
I couldn't have said it any better, Reverend Jude. What a powerful sentiment. It looks like you have an idea, Reverend Peggy, and I'm curious.
Well, so I see this in two ways. So I see this idea of like, do we trust the hierarchy? And as you use, the answer is usually no. But actually, there's so much rest that comes from trusting and from putting into positions of authority people who can be trusted and committing to creating a culture of trust, not just a culture of trust, but of worthiness of trust, so that what happens in some systems, and we'll momentarily call it the Catholic system a little bit, which is that people were elevated without accountability, and then once in that position there was no accountability and there was tremendous abuse and there was no way. And that's why we have so many UUs who are like, let's not trust just because you're an authority. And I think that's a good thing. Just because you're an authority doesn't mean you're worthy of it. Instead, I would love to see a system, and I think we see it a little bit in congregations actually, largely when it comes to committees on ministry, but also when it comes to boards, this idea of like, who in this circle has authority just by virtue of who they are, that they are just wise and balanced and they have experience or they have perspective or they bring joy, and those are the people, and we elevate those people and put them in positions to become for us filters so that we don't all have to make every decision, right? We don't want to, none of us have the time or the interest probably to make every decision that happens all the time. Right? I was just in one of our board meetings and someone said, shouldn't we get, we should get a committee of congregants to make this decision, and someone else was like, I think we're them. I think we're the ones who were elected to make the decision, right? But you need that. You need for some group or some person to say, okay, like the buck does stop with me. And you need to have cultivated a system where those people are in fact trustworthy. That's hard. And that comes from profound relationship building. I can trust you because I've known you for a long time, or I saw how you acted in that other situation, or because I know, because we broke bread together, because we shared a meal together, because I know your family and I've been to your home, and and then I
Yeah.
know I can trust you.
The everyday things matter deeply, right?
Mhm.
It's powerful. And I hear the cultivation of relationship as such a foundational part of that trust. You know, we have to be somehow connected. That to me is the both big and small of accountability is relationship. We have to be connected in some way. I'm thinking about where our democratic process succeeds and fails to protect us, to keep us safe, and to move us forward. And I think that accountability is perhaps the secret of where democratic process succeeds. It's okay to wield disproportionate power if you're accountable for it. It's okay to connect to a sense of majority rule if you're also accountable to marginalized communities who to whom you're accountable. I guess I said that in the same way twice.
I
Well,
think it's good. No, it's an important clarification, I think.
yeah, that accountability is really the root of it. I think that's where our democratic process could get its strength in our congregations, especially.
Well, and cultivating a culture of forgiveness too, right? Because we're going to make such mistakes, and so you enter these relationships. You enter relationships of accountability, a variety of them, including with marginalized communities, and and then you also weave into that a culture of forgiveness so that when leaders make mistakes, we sort of accept people apologize, right? You recognize what you've done, you say it really clearly, you vow to change whatever that was, and then you forgive people. Like that's part of like building this in, which is, much easier on the small scale of our congregations. Every time the size gets larger, it gets more difficult. In some ways,
Mm.
I find larger congregations to be a little bit easier because everyone, in some ways, is detached more. They feel less inclined that every voice matters in the same way, and it's a little bit easier to manage. But once you get past congregations and into, say, towns or
Mm.
like school districts and then cities and states and countries, like then it's very difficult and often impossible to build the relationships. And so then we lean back on this idea, or I lean back on this idea of, well, then there's the right of conscience, right? Then we just have to trust that people, it's this optimistic view of human nature, that we have to trust that people are making the best choices. And when they're making choices that we can't possibly understand, to consider that there may actually be, I mean, it's so easy to say they're voting out of their own best interest, like, or that's not even going to work for them, and that could be true. But it could also be true that they know something about what they need that we don't know, and that it's sometimes worth, I think the principle calls us to remember that it's worth giving them the dignity of making that choice for themselves.
Hmm.
They can't be in relationship with everybody, right? So then we come back to this ground of we have the right of conscience.
That's
Mm.
something hierarchy really struggles to do, is to give someone the dignity to make a choice of any choice of any kind. Hierarchy is happy to present choices and to make decisions for the purpose of consolidating power. It's good at continuing itself.
Mm.
And so, and I hear you talk about trust in this profound way, trusting strangers to make their own choices for themselves. To me, that looks and feels an awful lot like a step in faith. That trusting somebody is not based on your experience of them. It's based on what you believe to be true about people. It's a shift in orientation.
You were using the word accountability, and I think it's so often in UU circles, it has a tendency for white UUs. It has a tendency to feel like an attack because I'm going to be held accountable for, and it doesn't have to play out that way, and it doesn't necessarily play out that way. Reverend Peggy was talking about forgiveness, and we have to learn how to do that. I wish we had a word for that that meant more like assessing how we remain in relationship with one another. And we don't quite
Hmm.
have that in English, but that's what we're talking about. Because not everything is a venial sin or a felony. Sometimes we speak faster than our brains are thinking and reveal something about ourselves that's hurtful to people around us. And it's hurtful. And how do we remain in relationship with one another? It's not the end of the world to just apologize, state it out loud, and I'll try to do better.
Mm-hmm.
If any of us theologians can come up with that word, we might help us all out.
The language I bring is often marred by the sort of trauma of the way that it's lived out in other spaces, but I can see the word penance for me was once interpreted as the practice by which we come to grace. It's the practice by which we return to our center, and it takes work. There are real actions that are involved in that. Penance isn't simply to say a prayer, but it likely includes several prayers. Penance means returning to right relation with your body.
Mm-hmm.
And we return back to Catholic confession. We both, Reverend Peggy and I, you said it out loud. You got to say the thing you did out loud first.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
it.
It's so true. Oh, what a powerful thing.
Yeah, it almost feels like as you use, we recoil from the language. And I think that we recoil from the language because often we recoil from the action. We are not terribly good necessarily at that level of humility of being humble in its real form of like knowing yourself, having integrity in that way. And I think it would serve us really well. I mean, I think of the Protestant traditions that include even a general confession and worship that we stay away from. And we have a unison affirmation, like these are theologically the things we affirm, but not a personal confession that says like, I, like you, I'm kind of broken and I screw things up and I trip over myself and I hurt other people and I feel guilt and I feel shame and sometimes I don't feel enough guilt or shame and I'm hoping to be better. Like with whatever time I have left, I'm hoping that I make myself and the world around me better.
That's powerful. Here, and I've seen what you're saying, that in traditional UU services or typical UU services, that there's not a similar ritual, a communal worshipful practice in your service. And yet, I wonder where the space is for us to cultivate that humility and cultivate some of that wisdom. I see it happening in our church, in our congregation, in our efforts to put love at the center by naming it in groups. We try to say the thing out loud that happened, not just in one-on-one spaces. And it's not easy. I can think of times that I have at the church council, tried to describe a conversation that went awry. And I similarly recoiled from just saying the thing. But there's something in the practice and there's something in the transparency of accountability that feels like part of the work of UUism.
It's that spirit, as you call it, the spiritual technology, Brother Zachary, of our covenant, where we go back to what were our agreements and how do we get back into right relationship with one another. And it is true. I can only think in our current hymnals of about 2 readings that are confessions, one by Rob Eller Isaacs and Marjorie Bowens Wheatley, the other one. And they often get used, if at all, once a year.
So I just wrote down a little piece of paper, covenant and confession and worship.
Yes.
About this.
I'm so curious, knowing that we're probably likely nearing the end of our conversation, where some of the tensions that have come up have pushed us. And Reverend Peggy, I hear you making a note that maybe worship is a space in our congregations that we can intentionally cultivate the humility and accountability that makes us good citizens in our church. I really like that. And I think for me, I'm really bouncing back and forth with this idea of citizenship and its problems and difficulties. I may want to rest in the authority of my minister, but I also must hold accountability for my presence. I must hold my own vote as a participant in the community. I think there's a both and too.
Yeah, I think there is too. I think there's something about using, remembering, holding love always in understanding other people, right? And that this general principle of democratic process and saying that every person really is trustworthy, and the idea that some people have been thinking about this more and some people have been working on this more, and that we can trust them maybe even more insofar as they have more information, and when they say that this is a good path for us, that
Mm.
we have the right to disagree, we have our vote, but that there's also something beautiful about trusting the community and trusting the wisdom that comes from shared experience and leadership, people who are moving a few steps faster, who are right in front of us. And there's comfort in that, and there's the responsibility of still discerning, right? Like that person is a few steps ahead and I see where they're going, but I still don't agree with them. And that we trust them anyway. They still have a vote.
Mm.
I think that the principle itself was grounded in this ultimate optimism about the human condition. And I think that it's good. Like, I think if we used this as a filter for so many of the things we do in congregational and in public life, we
Mm.
would be set on a stronger, wiser, healthier path.
Mm.
And it's a mirror for what we do in human civilization. We're not all farmers, we're not all doctors. We don't get to the points of education and specialization without relying intrinsically on our fellow citizens next to us. And that struggle that all three of us talk about of moving away from consumer identity to citizenship, whether it's in our churches or congregations or synagogues or in politics, is key. And it's on a microcosm, the inability to trust a specialist, even if you might get a second opinion, right?
Mm.
That's natural, but we're in a system where we need to trust specialists, or we don't have electricity, we don't have running water.
Mm.
And there's something about that in our theology too. It doesn't mean that we aren't part of this. All of us are part of this. We don't get ministers without congregations. We're all intrinsically reliant on one another in this wider community. Thank you all. Thank you, particularly Reverend Peggy, for visiting us as a guest on our podcast this session. It has been a joy to be with you all, and I look forward to seeing you at our next podcast, whoever is listening or watching.